Well, good evening, and I'm delighted to be here to share with you my research on the psychodynamics of emotion and political culture. Before I begin, I want to thank Professor John Vinney for his very kind introduction, and Mark Covell and Rachel Bowen and others in the BU events team for organising this event. Thanks also to my lovely colleagues, students who are here, friends and lots of my family, and also members of the public from Bournemouth who've travelled to this beautiful hotel tonight on a cold winter's evening to hear my talk, and I look forward to chatting with some of you afterwards. Now, in this lecture, I take a psychocultural approach that brings together object relations psychoanalysis, cultural and political studies to explore the psychodynamics of emotion and power and the unconscious fantasies that circulate in relation to politics and its leaders in Western political culture. A key theme of my paper is the relationship between casino culture and politics. I'm using the term casino culture as a metaphor that describes the real and imagined risks discussed by the sociologist Ulrich Beck in his thesis of risk society. I argue that this experience of risk is also psychically driven by extreme manic impulses at individual, cultural, and political levels of experience. I'm using the term manic to refer to a psychological defense that denies and guards against the passivity of feelings associated with emptiness, of depression and helpless anxiety by taking up an opposite, triumphantly active attitude, and this is expressed at individual and cultural levels. My paper will take, I've timed it at home, it will be 45 minutes, and we've already started. And it's an academic paper, and it takes place in 3 parts. Okay. I begin by discussing psychoanalytic understandings of play, and I'm going to apply those understandings to the theme of political culture. In the second part, I'm going to turn to the contemporary scene of casino culture, which provides a context for the ethos, values, and images of casino politics and its leaders. In the third section, I develop the themes discussed so far by turning to the populist appeal, or not, of Donald Trump in the US, and I'll also make some references to other UK politicians, such as Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson in the UK. In this talk, I'll be looking at images of male politicians, where one can see a number of powerful emotions and fantasies at play in relation to them and their masculinity. So, part 1, the politics of play and political culture. The psychological assessment of Donald Trump and his alleged pathologies have received a fair amount of attention from clinicians, journalists, and cultural commentators. Yet whilst the individual traits and life history of a politician can add to our understanding of his or her motivations and actions, it's also important to take into account the wider cultural processes that shape the actions and political personas of leaders and the ways in which we relate to them as objects of the political imagination. In other words, Trump and his appeal, or not, cannot be separated from the wider social and cultural context of the political culture in which he operates. And it is this political culture that will be the focal point for my talk this evening. And I think it's helpful to define what I mean by political culture. So I've got a kind of working definition here. Political culture has been defined as that which includes political experience, imagination, values and dispositions that shape both the environment for the political system and the character of political processes, systems of political communication and political behaviour. And I've got that from Corner and Pell's book. Now, the spaces for political engagement that have emerged within the mediatized field of political culture can be linked to what the psychoanalyst D.W. Winnicott, that's Donald Woods Winnicott, calls the cultural field of the psyche and imagination. Winnicott provides an interactive model of the relationship between the self, culture, and society that challenges the traditional boundaries between notions of inner and outer reality. He argues that social, cultural, and personal experience intersect to produce what he calls a potential of transitional space, where meanings are made and remade, and where one's sense of selfhood, identity, and political subjectivity are also discovered. A psychocultural approach to the study of political culture and leadership takes account of these different interconnecting layers of meaning and experience, where the relationship between leaders and followers or supporters is created through the processes of attachment, mirroring, and identification, and also through the unconscious processes of play and its illusions within the political field. Winnicott foregrounded the role of play in the development of the self through its interaction with the environment. And the first environment is the mother, then the family, and then society. Now, Winnicott said that play is the basis for creativity and also for the development of the self. He said that play is the key to our emotional and psychological well-being. For Winnicott, play is what happens in the interface between our inner world and external reality. It takes place neither solely in the imagination nor solely in the external world, but instead it happens in what he defines as a transitional space in which the external world is found and shaped and engaged with. In his theory of play, he not only considered the playing of infants and children, but also the importance of play as it continues into adult life. For instance, when adults play through making art, or practicing science, or making jokes, having conversations, and perhaps giving an inaugural lecture. He also said that abstractions of politics, and actually used that term, can be viewed as highly developed forms of playing. And he said that in his book, Playing and Reality, which, if you don't know Winnicott's work, is a brilliant place to begin. In the early noughties, I began to apply Winnicott's ideas of play and transitional phenomena to the processes of political culture. Winnicott's model of play seemed apt, particularly in the early days of social media and its spontaneous, interactive forms of political communication. Gosh, it all seems a long time ago. We had this idea of it, didn't we? At that time, social media appeared promising as a progressive force and as a way to enhance citizenship and the workings of democracy. A few years earlier, there was also, for some, a brief period of optimism when New Labour first came into power after the end years of a tired Conservative government. In gendered terms, there were more women in Parliament. And at first, Tony Blair, yes, he was called Bambi then, and had a fresh-faced metrosexual persona and attitude that seemed to challenge the old uptight establishment, as some saw it at the time. In the UK, the emotive outpouring following Princess Diana's death implied, for some, a shift towards a less repressed society and the emergence of a more emotionally literate and integrated period of politics that was governed less by destructive forms of projection as in previous years. However, it emerged that the playful nature of political communication had another side that was connected to the promotional dynamics of politics and what is often called the culture of spin, which actually has a long history, but which soon became associated with New Labour and Cameron's Conservatives. So, that's a nice picture of play there with Winnicott and somebody playing. Okay. The laddish nature of New Labour political communication also became evident, something which in retrospect, there we go, it was kind of quite a playful time with these posters, and it was quite a kind of laddish feel, yeah? Something which in retrospect, and in the light of recent allegations of sexism at Westminster, perhaps takes on a new significance. Although throughout the noughties, we also became aware of the promotional glitz of celebrity politics, epitomised by Silvio Berlusconi and his bunga parties, and the bling-bling president, Nicolas Sarkozy, who were very much present on the European scene. A series that included 9/11, the Iraq War, the banking crash, contributed to an increased disenchantment and cynicism in the effectiveness of political democracy and its leaders. If we now fast forward to the contemporary political scene, where against a backdrop of war, the spread of terror, and global and economic precarity, we've seen the growth of right-wing populism across Europe and in the US, and the rise of politicians such as Donald Trump with its links to Breitbart News and so on. Today, we could say that political culture, with its links to celebrity, fake news, fake history, together with the manic character of so much social media communication, has taken a new turn. So, is the analysis of political culture which is based on Winnicott's reading of healthy play and healthy interactive communication, still applicable when applied to the mood of politics in the current climate? I think in many ways it's not. Here, I want to turn instead to the French psychoanalyst André Green, who provides us with an alternative reading of play which can be applied to the political scene. Now, André Green says that while Winnicott focused on healthy play and a positive relationship to creativity and communication, we also need to think about the sadism that can underform some forms of play. He actually talks about you can be a very creative torturer. He says that play can be cruel and narcissistic and not based on interchange at all, but on the will to dominate. This description of play is useful when applied to the psychodynamics of political leadership and communication in an age of risk and seductive celebrity politics, where the impulse to both excite and also to control and master uncertainty often dominates. André Green illustrates the unhealthy, manic forms of play when he cites the example of Russian roulette, which is a game where a destructive gambling impulse is present. It's interesting to note that the excitement of Russian roulette was also described by another Green, Graham Greene, one of my favourite authors. I love him. In his autobiography, A Sort of Life, which I really recommend if you like his work and haven't read it, where he says that he used Russian roulette as a way to stave off depression as a teenager in the boarding school where his father was the headmaster. He says, I remember an extraordinary sense of jubilation, as if carnival lights had been switched on in a dark, drab street. My heart knocked in its cage, and life contained an infinite number of possibilities. And there he is, as kind of a young Graham Greene. You can't get it all, I couldn't get it all on, but it says, unhappiness in a child accumulates because he sees no end to the dark tunnel. The 13 weeks of a term might just as well have been 30 years. And his preoccupation with this theme of gambling was there in his book also, Loser Takes All. It's kind of there in his work throughout his life. André Green picks up this theme when he says that play can be cruel and repetitive, and that it may be used as a manic way to ward off sadness and loss. Now, André Green's emphasis on the repetitive nature of play is linked to his reading of Freud's 1920 essay, Beyond the Pleasure Principle. In that essay, Freud describes how his 18-month-old grandson, little Ernst, used a cotton reel with string attached to it, which he repeatedly threw out of his cot and then pulled back as a way to manage his mother's absence. This Freud called the 4-dar game, which the boy used as a way to master his feelings of loss when his mum left the room. So the child would chuck the reel out of the cot and exclaim, "Ooh!" and then he'd pull the reel back and exclaim, "There!" The returning cotton reel reassured the child of his mother's return. Now, I'm going to be talking about casino culture and its politics, and while Freud's description of play in this context has been interpreted in many ways, I think that it's evocative and useful when applied to the image of the gambler at the blackjack table, or the city trader who attempts to master the odds by being the player, rather than the one who is played with by the forces of the global market, or perhaps the politician who decides to manage the problems in his own party by taking a punt, putting everything on red, and holding a referendum. Andre Green says that loss and substitution are always coupled in the process of play. Yet in those instances when the experience of loss is too great, the quality of play alters and becomes linked to the compulsion to repeat. Instead of using objects in a healthy and creative and transformative way, they merely become substitutes of reality, where wounded narcissism, together with feelings of loss and shame, are constantly denied and instead may be replaced by a manic sense of euphoria. So what emerges then from these theories of play are the links between play, communication, creativity, illusion and disillusion, but also the way in which play is linked to feelings of mastery, sadism, and the sensibility of the gambler. From a psychoanalytic perspective, the repetitive play of the gambler becomes a way to attempt to manage loss, anxiety, and shame, and also Oedipal aggression. I'm going to apply these theories of play to the field of political culture and to real and fictional representations of political leadership, where fantasies associated with gambling and casino culture more generally are often expressed. One can apply these ideas to the political personas of charismatic male politicians such as Donald Trump, Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson. Despite their differences, they project an image of themselves to their supporters as playful, funny, warm and charming. And yet, their populist appeal also contains a certain manic quality that is characteristics of politicians in an age of casino politics. As I'm going to discuss in more depth in relation to Trump, all three men arguably evoke a style of political communication that brings to mind Andre Green's description of play as being linked to power and mastery. Their campaigning style suggests an element of being slapped and tickled, and a sort of tantalizing play of now you see him, now you don't. As like actors, they break the fourth wall, step in and out of role as politician, celebrity, friend and partner in crime, as they invite you to join them in scoffing at the dishonest establishment, of which they are a part. And often at what they see as the modern curse of liberal values and so-called political correctness. The tantalizing aspects of their appeal resonate with the ups and downs of what I have identified as the development of casino politics, which is also linked to the landscape of casino culture. And I'm now going to turn to that landscape. So now it's part 2 of this talk. There we go. There they are, Farage and Trump in a golden lift, and there he is at the Olympics. Okay. Over the past 20 years, the term casino culture has been used as a metaphor to convey the widespread experience of uncertainty and risk that permeates different aspects of social, economic, and cultural life. Some of this work draws on Ulrich Beck's well-known sociological thesis of risk society. whilst others, such as the American cultural critic Henry Giraud, apply the economist Susan Strange's analysis of casino capitalism to analyse the instabilities of global capitalism. She wrote, I think in 1997, she anticipated much of what was to happen, actually 10 years later. And she wrote, "The Western financial system is rapidly coming to resemble nothing as much as a vast casino. Every day, games are played in this casino that involve large sums of money, so large that they cannot be imagined. The croupiers in this global financial casinos are the big bankers and brokers. They play, as it were, for the house." Strange's vivid description of the world of global finance is still highly evocative in the current age. When discussing casino culture, Henry Giraud, echoing the work of Mark Fisher, for those of you who know his work, provides a pessimistic picture of neoliberalism and its market-driven values as an ideological force that now permeates all aspects of culture, politics, and society. Here, the illusory promise of winning becomes the raison d'etre, providing a key motivation to keep on going in a sea of uncertainty and risk. If the casino once only denoted an actual place where people went and played games in order to win money, its ethos and the ludic qualities associated with it are now widespread, and fantasies of winning and losing have become culturally embedded as a way of life. The seductive power of politicians such as Trump, Farage, or Johnson is related to their masculine personas as players who like to win. As objects of cultural fantasy, they each, to an extent, seem to evoke the figure of the buccaneering gambler entrepreneur who creates feelings of risk, excitement, and uncertainty, but then, as in the practices of marketing more generally, they heroically promise to overcome that risk and make it better, as in Trump's promise to make America great again. Just going to have a quick swig of water. The current preoccupation with risk has been well documented, and sociologists have described the shift from a phobic culture, where you really fear risk, to a risk-aphiliac one, where you really embrace risk. Today, I think these two impulses often come together, so that you fear risk, but you're also drawn to it. And I think this reflects the kind of manic quality of casino culture that I've been describing. Sociologists say that not only has there been a change in the nature of risk, but there has also been a shift in cultural sensibilities, and above all, in strategies for dealing with risk. In a society where the values of the casino dominate, problems become individualized and are perceived as either the product of chance or of individual action. In a deregulated global marketplace where there is a continuous proliferation of new millionaires and new paupers, the stakes are ever higher. Perhaps not surprisingly, the experience of pushing the boundaries of risk have been described by sociologists as edging. Edging refers to the desires to experience the uncertainties of the edge. Edging can be traced back to the countercultural hedonism of the 1970s that equated risk-taking with freedom and a refusal to kowtow to society's norms. A later version of this can be found in Susan Jeffers' 1980s self-help mantra, "Feel the fear and do it anyway." The experience of edging can be likened to sociologist Irving Goffman's notion of fatefulness, which he applied to the experience of encountering the unknown in the casino and the freedom that comes when risking all on a game of chance. As the wonderful essayist and poker player Alvarez says, a version, there we have it, a version of this can be found in romantic accounts of men playing poker who use it as a test of manliness and character. Of course, the mythology of the poker player is a world away from contemporary postmodern experience of the online gambler who competes mindlessly with algorithms as a way to switch off from the emotional and practical demands of the day job. In the US, the myth of the skilled poker player who is able to push the limits of risk and freedom is one that has a long history, going back to the gun-toting poker players of Doc Holliday, Wild Bill Hickok and others. As I discuss in relation to Trump, notions of speculation and chance are also bound up with the politics of the American dream. As Alex de Tocqueville argued in his book Democracy in America, it was the belief in luck and the non-religious secularized notion of chance that separated the US from the more uptight, rigidly stratified society of its European cousins. He said, "Those living in the instability of a democracy have the constant image of chance before them, and in the end they came to like all those projects in which chance plays a part. Not only because of the promise of profit, but because they like the emotions evoked." The emotionality of gambling and its history in the US reflects a duality within the capitalist desire for speculation between a form of self-control associated with the virtuous Puritan work ethic and a more heady mix of excitement, danger and vice associated with the recklessness of the gaming tables, or indeed in the behaviour of the stock market financiers, described so vividly by Susan Strange. As historians of gambling have pointed out, there was always a tension in the US gambling sensibility between so-called virtuous, socially sanctioned business speculation on the one hand and reprobate gamblers on the other. And there they are, the two kinds of gambling, speculation rather. Today, the business of gambling and the practice of speculation on the financial markets share much in common, thereby blurring the boundaries even further between what is considered legitimate and non-legitimate business. This ambiguity also mirrors the loss of faith in the grand narrative of the US as a land of chance and opportunity. One could say that today the practice and values of gambling that underpin casino culture permeate the world and contribute to its instabilities. Gambling is now a huge global business, and for example in the UK, the growth of internet gambling combined with the hugely popular national lottery has meant that gambling has become normalised as a way of life. The arbitrariness of being either an economic winner or loser are recurrent themes in popular culture. I've mentioned the widespread use of the lottery, and there's also the growth of celebrity culture, where social mobility becomes linked to the luck of making it on talent shows such as The X Factor or Britain or America's Got Talent, where the promise of instant fame and wealth allows for the circulation of fantasies underpinned by illusion and magical thinking about winning the jackpot. And politicians also want to get in on the act, don't they, when they have these celebrity versions of these. And I'm thinking of I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here. They had Kezia Dugdale on it. And Big Brother, do you remember when George Galloway dressed up as a cat and with Rula Lenska? Perhaps we don't want to remember that, but I think he thought this would help his sort of political capital as well. Often, such shows foreground fantasies of entrepreneurship, where perhaps you can become a millionaire overnight by patenting one-off inventions on TV shows such as Dragon's Den. As is well known, Donald Trump's image as a celebrity entrepreneur was cemented on the US version of the reality show The Apprentice, where the values of macho risk-taking were pushed to the fore. An ambivalent fascination with the power of bankers as bad but exciting symbols of masculine hedonism is a perennial theme of Hollywood cinema, and we see it in films such as Wall Street, Money Never Sleeps, The Wolf of Wall Street, or The Big Short. And more recently, I don't know if any of you kind of will ever admit to watching this, but the US TV hit Billions, which is quite Moorish actually. where in different ways the themes of masculinity, gambling, excess, addiction and power are foregrounded and often celebrated. In such films and TV shows, the unreliability of luck is often coded as feminine and castrating. And as in the term Lady Luck, who in the famous words of the song from Guys and Dolls, luck was never a lady to begin with, luck be a lady tonight. In the US, the mythology around luck and poker, and also its symbolic value as the US national game, can often be found in accounts about the ways in which US presidents have played poker in and outside White House. And Harry Truman and Richard Nixon are cited as examples of this practice. Indeed, popular, albeit cliched notions of good political leadership become aligned with ideas about the courage and skill of the poker player. There is a widely held popular perception that a test of a good leader is that he or she has the courage to take appropriate risks, as in the context of tough foreign policy decisions or the economy. And I mentioned the referendum earlier. The asymmetry of gender is often present when when applied to notions of risk in casino politics, as for example in the 2016 presidential campaign, when Hillary Clinton was often represented as the risk rather than as an effective and bold risk taker. In casino politics, it's often a case of who is identified as the risk, who is made to carry the risk on behalf of others. At the level of fiction, the dilemmas of risk and political leadership can be seen in the hugely successful Netflix political television drama, House of Cards. You may want to look away now. There's a sort of... where, like Game of Thrones, the show's title infers that politics is a game to be played. The recent US version of House of Cards is a remake of the original 1990 UK series of the same name, a trilogy written by Michael Dobbs, who himself was a politician within the Conservative government in 1989 when Thatcher was in power. A TV drama such as House of Cards contributes to both the shaping of political culture and both reflects and affects the attitudes, emotions, and fears at conscious and unconscious levels of experience. Now, Frank Underwood, infamously now, and I gather no more, played by Kevin Spacey, is an evil Machiavellian politician whose pursuit of power is linked to a desire to win at all costs and a readiness to gamble in order to win. And these impulses drive him on to murder his rivals, blackmail a president, and then to take his place. What we see in House of Cards is a ruthless denial of vulnerability, and the addictive quality of binge-watching it on Netflix also echoes, perhaps, the same underlying themes of the programme itself, where the perverse pleasures of play, described by Green, dominate. Let's have a glass of water. The psychoanalytic concept of the manic defence seems apt when applied to the character of Frank Underwood. In his character, we see that the gambler is no longer looking for the excited and triumphant state of mind that serves to deny an otherwise internal deadness, or what Winnicott referred to as the fear of breakdown. Forensic psychotherapist Estella Weldon has discussed this defensive state of mind in relation to the wish to fend off the black hole of depression and death. And she links this to the charisma and charm of the flirt, who uses that charm as a means of mastering that that insecurity and controlling the object as represented in the guise of a rival or a lover, or in this context, the electorate. At the wider cultural and political levels, Frank Underwood's deathly games of flirtation seem to reflect the dynamics of play within casino culture more widely, that are shaped defensively by the processes of repetition and mastery, as described by Andre Green. The dystopian elements of the show are often commented on, and it's seen as a drama for a post-Hope era. For example, the New York Times said, whereas Michael Sheen's performance as Joshua Bartlett in the 1990s political drama The West Wing seemed to represent the good father and what we wished our government could be, Frank Underwood represents a nightmare of what our government has become. Which brings us to Donald Trump. Sorry about that. Okay. Oops, but if I stand here, you won't get the feedback. Okay. Since the 1980s, Trump has been in the public eye both through his notable success and failure as a businessman, owner of casinos, and husband of beautiful women. His popular celebrity persona on the TV game, The Apprentice, also links him to the values of casino culture. His identity as a TV icon shows the extent to which celebrity culture and politics are really closely entwined, and the myth of his competence during the 2016 presidential election campaign largely stemmed from his performance as the strong and decisive leader on that program and as someone who is a casino capitalist and politician par excellence. During the 2016 campaign, Trump showed his skill as a politician by deflecting onto Hillary Clinton the anti-authority populist anger that was felt towards the establishment. Cultural historian Richard Sennett argues that historically, the growth of personality-oriented politics is linked to the emergence of secular charisma, where the residual envy or resentment of voters in relation to powerful politicians is warded off by focusing on the personality and image of the politician, rather than the substantial political issues and policies. Donald Trump's appeal as a leader has been achieved through a form of faux intimacy that he creates as he offers himself up as an object of attachment for his supporters, alongside the ritual chanting games at his rallies, which brings to mind the cruel games of the playground and darker moments in history. His success is also linked to the passionate declarations of love and empathy that he seems to have for those citizens, often referred to as the left-behinds, who normally feel despised and unloved by the establishment politicians such as Hillary Clinton, who referred to them as the deplorables. As Trump said in his 2016 inauguration address, and I can't impersonate him, he said, "My protection will lead to great prosperity and strength. I will fight for you with every breath of my body, and I will never let you down." In other words, his appeal is that alongside the excitement of cocking a snook at the establishment and taking a punt on the Donald, is that he is also able to deploy his skills as a communicator to deflect the dangers of risk in an age of social and economic precarity. Trump has some very affluent supporters, and very possibly quite a few Russian ones too. And yet, one can argue that his skill has been to mobilize the emotions of his core base by tapping into a vein of shame amongst those citizens who can't provide for their families, who feel rejected or left behind by the forces of modernity, globalization, and the values of social liberalism. And Ali Hochschild writes about this in her fabulous book, Strangers in Their Own Land. Whilst the effective relationship between class and politics is really important here, discourses of race and white privilege are also highly significant. For example, Trump has been called the first white president because of his role in the birther movement and also because of his links to white supremacist groups. And we see this extended to the UK through his sympathetic tweets of Britain First. In this way, discourses of risk and shame and the defensive fantasies that circulate in relation to them, which operate by identifying with the omnipotence of the leader and by projecting that shame onto others, cannot be separated from the hegemonic structures of power and the politics of intersectionality. We see these processes both in relation to Brexit and in the politics of Trump. In both contexts, one can argue that shame has played a role in stigmatizing groups such as welfare and benefit claimants, refugees, migrants, Muslims, and women who are defined as abject and other, and who are made to carry shame on behalf of others. The opposite of shame is the experience of omnipotence and invulnerability, and it's this feeling of manic mastery that is a feature of the compulsive gambler who can't acknowledge failure. When Trump puffs up his chest and promises to risk all, when keeping us on the edge of our seats with his infamous tweets about war at 2 a.m, he too also presents himself as a self-idealized winner, who, in the vernacular of the wise guys in the film Goodfellas, promises to take care of business. So, what Donald Trump and Nigel Farage share is an appeal to a new kind of politics, which, as I've said, is epitomized by the image of the showman, buccaneer, with its playful risk-taking aura. Both politicians play up to the fear of, say, the danger of Europe or foreigners, and then they promise to shield the public from it. This rhetoric is often underpinned by a melancholic wish to return to a consoling fantasy of an earlier, safer time that reassures and which embraces history as an uncanny likeness of the past. In the case of Farage and also Boris Johnson in the UK, this narrative rests on a kind of colonial vision of England that's free from the castrating nanny skirts of Europe. And for Trump, there is also a pledge to restore the nation to some notion of its former greatness. The repetitive narrative of history that's presented here returns us to Freud's theory of play and beyond the pleasure principle. Freud argued that the repetitive nature of play is used, like in the example of the cotton wool, as an attempt to mask loss and vulnerability. I'm also reminded here of the work of psychoanalyst Thomas Ogden, who referred to those who repeatedly flirt with death and dance with danger in order to experience a feeling of reality and aliveness that defends against trauma and those aspects of the past which are hard to bear. It also evokes for me the quality of politics and its cultures in the current climate, where history is used and abused, and where the violent underpinnings of political communication, as flirtatious mastery, as described by Andre Green, asserts itself, and where the healthy interactive dimension of play as a way of communication is lost. That pattern of relating is present in the extreme rhetoric of Trump, who, in the destructive manner of repetition compulsion, uses the big lie propaganda technique by repeating his version of the truth over and over again to bash his detractors into submission. Such behavior is analogous to the wish of the gambler who needs to win over and over again. At the unconscious level, such a strategy, with its ghostly echoes of deathly repetition, seemed to carry in its wake the affective traces of earlier social and political traumas that are denied and which remain unmourned, and which, as objects of history, are now perhaps returning to haunt us. With that in mind, I want to finish by turning back to the UK context, where the murder of Labour MP Jo Cox by a right-wing extremist, Thomas Mair, at the height of the UK referendum campaign, provides a tragic example of such processes at work. Jo Cox's politics of inclusion and her readiness to engage with others in a lively and open way resonate with the creative elements of play described by Winnicott. The almost ritualistic nature of her murder at that moment of high tension, which can be viewed as an attack on her as a symbol of generative femininity, was arguably linked to some of the destructive processes that I've described. And yet, her bereaved husband, Brendan Cox, as mourner, who has mourned privately and publicly on our behalf, provides us with an example of how that destructive manic impulse, as acted out by Mayer, can individually and collectively be resisted by creating new ethical and political spaces for resistance and for the flourishing of hope and not hate. To conclude then, I've set out to show that the deployment of a psychocultural approach to the scene of what I have called casino politics and its leaders allows one to go beyond the socio-economic and cultural accounts of risk and risk society, and to instead explore and also confront the powerful emotional and psychodynamic currents that underpin it. It is an approach that allows us to examine the different registers of meaning that are bound up with the interplay of cultural, political, and affective experience. Such an approach, which draws on object relations psychoanalysis and reworks it for the contemporary age, also contributes to the emerging field of psychopolitical studies. I would argue that this is a timely move, given the complex, irrational, and emotive nature of political culture today.